So the talk is attempting to delve into some of the subtleties in the change between scene light and display. So we capture with a camera, we end up on a display. Lots of things can happen in between. We might call those things an optical to optical transform. That's what it's called in some documents. BT 2100 and ACES pursue basically the definition of light in and something coming out the other end. It's OOTF, optical to optical, is really the key to all forms of color science. And you could call the centerpiece of that color rendering. That's just a terminology, but it is common. And trying to see how I best see this, but a consistent family is needed if you have a variety of displays. So the displays in a home today might measure wildly differently in terms of their brightness and dark capability and their surround. So appearance compensation is an attempt to deal with the appearance phenomenon that are to some degree fairly well understood. Mark Fairchild wrote a very nice text on color appearance modeling, and he lays out this several sets of color appearance phenomena. These particular ones are pixel independent, so there are things that you can do just on the pixels themselves without working on the surrounds. So the Abney effect is that constant hue versus a change in saturation goes along curved lines. So we'll delve into that a little bit. Stevens is that contrast increases with luminance. Well, that's part of the zing in an HDR display. Hunt is that colorfulness increases with absolute luminance. So flowers under sunlight are more colorful than the same chromaticity of flowers under the same spectral illuminant indoors. Now there are a couple of other odd ones here, and we'll do Bates-Brook. I'll just mention Helmholtz-Kohlrausch. Brightness increases with color saturation. That's an interesting one. So we've actually modeled and compensated some of these in our test system. So this one's the Bates-Brook monochromatic hue shift. If you take a narrow spectra like a laser and you brighten it, you actually change perceived hue, even though the wavelength is not changing. So this particular data set says we can change plus about 15 nanometers and minus about a little over 30 across the spectrum by going brighter by a factor of 10. So it's actually quite an interesting phenomenon, and since we're now talking about 20/20 primaries and laser primaries and going out into the spectrum locus, this work is now become relevant. So this is a bit of a complicated slide, but I'll spend a little time on it so we won't be in any hurry. In the middle of those curves is the CIE 1931 color matching functions, X bar, Y bar, Z bar. These are the basis of chromaticities for television. The P3 gamut is defined that way, ACES RGB is defined that way, Rec 709 is defined that way. There are other diagrams there are two others. One is the 10-degree standard observer made in about 1964, and that was because matching wall paint on a large area was not working with the 2-degree observer, which was matching small patches, and so that mainly is affecting the amplitude of blue. But a particularly interesting and timely relevant one is the Judd-Voss set. That's a 2-degree observer. Judd was the primary author of the Y-bar green curve in the original 1931 work, and so he was essentially correcting his work with this change in the 2-degree functions. And what you mainly see is on the cyan side of the blue peak is a big dip, and that's actually there, and that is the Judd offset that people are applying for the white balance of OLEDs. And boy, did we see this in my booth when we set up yesterday. It is an enormous effect, and you can see how large that is. Now, if we take a little line there, I think I can point at this for you. If we take this little line and we sweep it across, so we just take a line sample, what you can see is that you get a tremendous amount of variation. Well, that's how you define the spectrum locus, is you sweep a line across these curves. And that is basically saying that the spectrum locus is a fuzzy place. All these variations are variations in the spectrum locus for data sets on color matching functions. Now, down at the bottom, I'm liking this pointer here, down at the bottom of the slide, we have some other interesting topics here. I have put on here some triangles that get fatter. The Abney effect is an effect of hue versus color saturation. Well, it was done with adding white to a color and showed the curved lines. But you could also widen the spectrum, and that will make curved lines. If you just take the integrals of those things, you will find that that also curves. So in all cases, you get curves out of that. But if you put spikes up there and blend them with white, you will also still get curves. It's an interesting psychophysical thing. Now, the eyeball at the back of it has a yellow spot, and that's called the macula lutea, or the yellow spot, which means that things that fall outside of it will be perceived as more blue. If you're looking at something that's magenta, and it's in your center of view, and then you look off to the side a little bit or above, you'll see it gets more blue. You can actually see this with your own eyes. So hue is also a function of where you are looking. You will change the color of things by looking at them. And that is definitely an appearance effect. And then there's individual variation in the color matching function. These are averages. So this is the 1959 Stiles and Birch data set for 49 observers. So quite interesting stuff. So Abney says these things fall on curves. If you want to compensate for the colorfulness effect, which is that brighter things appear more colorful, and this includes desaturated things, doesn't just mean flowers. Pastel paints become more colorful if they're brighter. You're going to move along a saturation adjustment. Well, that's going to move along, curved lines. So that's a very interesting problem. Now, if you move blue towards neutral by desaturating it, you're affecting the luminance equation. You need to take into account luminance, so you've got to darken it. So brightness has to also be adjusted when you move along saturation axis. Now, if we take into account the stuff along the edge, that's the Bezold-Brooks says that absolute brightness is going to move the edge. Now, how much does that bleed in towards the center, and what's the shape of those curves? I don't know. I don't know of any work on this, but that's the implication, that if you can change if you can shift the perceived hue by just changing the brightness, then the edge of this thing near the spectrum locus is going to be a place of great interest. So clearly there's more to be done here. Okay, so that's kind of what that would look like. You'll see the lines. And these are the directions that they would move according to the Bezold-Brook. So Stevens is basically, you get brighter, it looks more contrasty. And this is the contrast boost idea in the optical to optical transform. Now there are also regional appearance effects. Those were all pixel effects. The regional effects, we'll show the next slide, Bartels and Brenneman, contrast increases with surround luminance. That is a very powerful effect. And if you look at a wider field of view, that will change it because of the yellow spot. That will change your perception, so that's a regional thing. There's some kind of an appearance effect of perceived contrast and brightness and even color having to do with screen being large in your field of view. And I don't know what to base this on other than everybody's talking with me about it. It's a lot of people are observing it. So if we have a surround that's pink, what do we do about that? My demonstration in the exhibit hall, I have a D65 surround, but what if you don't? What if you have a wall that has a color behind the TV? And then there are things like cone bleaching, and you walk in from outdoors, and I don't know what to do about any of those, but they're clearly powerful appearance effects. If you look at a purple spot for a while and then look away from it, you'll get an after image, a negative. Okay, so this one, these bars are a constant value, and the background is a gradient, and so your eye is being fooled into changing the brightness of the middle two bars especially, changing the perceived brightness. That constant brightness against a bright surround looks much darker. Well, if you take a face and you master a scene with a dark surround, and then you bring the surround up when you present it later on some other display, all of a sudden that face becomes much darker. And that really can be serious because you can lose the face altogether in the scene, even though it was perfectly fine on a dark surround. So this is a really powerful appearance effect, and if you don't compensate for it, or if you show in a theater and you always have dark surround, you're good. But if you don't compensate for this in a bright surround and you master it in a dark surround, or just you master it at a different surround level than what you present at, this effect can have a major impact. So these appearance phenomena, and Mark Fairchild's book predated HDR. And so I presume that all these things are still in play, and even more so with HDR. But we are kind of missing an update on these, on many of these. And they're powerful enough that it's probably an important thing to do sooner as opposed to later. So last year I presented the single master concept, and basically the idea is that the OOTF starts with camera raw, ends up with a display, and in the middle are an important kind of key thing, which is an S-curve tone shaping, and then there's the appearance compensation module, which is trying to deal with those things that I just described, and then something for display formatting. And I try to put the master over here in the scene referred side of things, and that's what I'm demonstrating in the innovation zone over there. Okay, so let me go back and just emphasize this. At every place in here, I'm using AP0 ACES primaries. So those are kind of my dominant glue signal format. And this is, if any of you have used ACES, this is what it looks like on a CIE diagram. It is defined on CIE 1931. Now, there is also ACES AP1, which is just outside of 2020, but there's some issues with these things. See if there are any points to, oh yes. It would be possible to define AP0 as a matrix from 2020's spectral definition. 2020 has chromaticity definition, but it also has a wavelength definition. And if you use some form of neutral, equal energy white, or a daylight curve, or some other combination of these guys, and these, a matrix times these, you can define the ACES primaries. They're not defined this way, but you could define them spectrally, and then the AP0 primaries would become completely independent of all color matching functions. So that, I think, is an interesting area to pursue. It may seem a little bit academic, but I assure you that it is not. Okay, so Okay. So the parametric appearance compensation, what it takes in are the display characteristics, its settings, it's set to a certain brightness level and et cetera, the viewing surround, and possibly something about the viewer's color matching functions. If you're older or younger, or if the screen is larger or smaller in your field of view, that can affect it. And then there's this display formatting. The display formatting, I think it's best to think of it just in terms of, I call it coding on the wire. If you have a display that takes in gamma 2.4 and you have a signal and you make an inverse gamma 2.4 and then send it to the display undoes it, it's basically a no-op, end-to-end being a no-op. And there are lots of caveats to this, but display formatting is an interesting topic, but it's a completely different issue than the appearance compensation. It's basically how best to use the wire. Okay, so the basic overview of the processing here is that I'm using the idea of not changing the ratio of red, green, and blue, especially if they're defined independently of color matching functions, at least the capability of doing that to calibrate things, compensating for the ambient level, colorfulness, absolute brightness, potentially color matching functions, your age, the size of the screen, and then the display type transform. And I think that the coding on the wire doesn't matter, but the appearance compensation and dealing with those is an important thing, but it doesn't matter how it's constructed. There are lots of ways to do it, but if you don't do it, you're missing an important aesthetic issue. So there's no use of metadata unless you convey color matching functions of people who master the scenes. You have to be at the receiving display to know its surround and its settings and its capabilities. So architecturally, things have to happen there. And the coding on the wire, you try to minimize the effect of that on the architecture. So I have a test system running. I'm demonstrating it over in the innovation zone. And it basically runs on two parameters, radiometric proportion, which is the Hunt effect kind of compensation, and display brightness. But that includes the ambient surround. And these things are all the coding on the wire choices. I can basically switch all those completely independently of the appearance processing. So I'm also doing a demonstration of an integer representation of ACE's AP0, wide range. So come see that. It's done using the 3D LUT box. And so it's built on this radiometric capability. That's kind of a key enabler for all these things. I'm using scene light even if grading. Josh Pines wanted me to call that faux scene referred, but it's scene referred with grading. It's also called ACES Prime, but it definitely seems to work. And there's a lot of future work that awaits in this stuff. So, and many of these effects are very significant visually. I mean, not sweep under the rug things. So I think I'm at my time.
We do have a few more minutes for questions, should there be any. Please raise your hand, and our microphone mavens will seek you out. While they're thinking of them, Gary, I was wondering, what are your thoughts about having this move into a standards or recommended practices sort of activity? Do you think this has relevance in terms of creating some new industry guidelines?
Well, some of it's understood well enough to you know, I'd like to nail down this integer version of the ACES big space. So I'd like people to look at that. But others of it, we need to understand it better before we try and nail it down.
So some work remains, or more?
Yeah, a lot of work remains.
What is the next step? What are you going to be doing?
Well, come see the demo. I've got some of it working, a lot of it actually, But my way of doing it is not the only way. As I said, any way of doing it is fine.
We have a question from the back, Bill.
So if a viewer with a variant color matching function is accustomed to looking at the world through that color matching function, compensating for that make it look weird or make it look right?
We're trying to capture the master in its, as seen by the reference colorist and director and cinematographer. We're trying to capture that and reproduce it for other people. But it's a subtle problem because it's, as you say, it's not obvious.
Well, here, I have another microphone. Merrill?
So, Gary, to help understand one of the phenomena you described a little better, with respect to the yellow cast, let me call it, at the center of focus, is that, if that's a reasonable term anyway, center of vision.
Yeah, yellow spot.
The yellow spot that was there. And then you mentioned that the area of view had an impact also on the color perception.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if those two are connected.
Oh yeah, it's due to that. Yeah, the 2-degree observer is just a little bigger than the yellow spot, but the 10-degree is way bigger. So you match differently.
So you're getting the combination.
Yeah, your brain's integrating the color. It says that's all one color, that's a wall. But the truth is, it's got different colors in the center and the edge.
If you said it, I didn't hear it, and I was trying to. It seemed like they would be connected.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions back there? I guess not. So thanks very much, Gary.